also a heritage in Mississauga. Our speaker this evening is Jeff Kaiser, who is a consulting biologist, and Jeff's giving me a bit of notes to assist me with introducing him. Jeff is a consulting biologist and ecologist, and he lives here in Mississauga. He offers expertise on natural features and biological elements and concerns to government and their agencies, private industries, and private landowners. After completing a master's degree at the University of Toronto on the response of a wetland plant, the common catchment, to heavy metal pollution, he began his professional career in the Environmental Services Division of an engineering firm, Proctor and Redfern. After several years with Ontario engineering firms and with the Parks section, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, in 1985, Mr. Kaiser began operating as an independent consultant. He's done biological survey work at such remote places as Smoky Falls, north of Kapuskasing, and Ear Falls, north of Dryden, and other well-known locations such as Windsor, Niagara Falls, Mississauga, and Cornwall. Mr. Kaiser has prepared a botanical inventory of the Bruce Peninsula National Park and a rare plant management plan for the St. Lawrence Islands National Park. He has participated in the environmental assessment of the proposed GO transit expansion of its lakeshore rail services to Mississauga and Oakville, and in the planned study of the Mississauga busway. And tonight we'll be talking to us about the Creditview Wetlands. I'm told not to call it the bog, not by him, but other people say don't call it the bog, so it is the wetlands. Mr. Kaiser?
Thank you, Ms. Patton. Ladies and gentlemen, very pleased to have this opportunity to address you tonight. The revisions that have been made or are being made to the Ontario Heritage Act to include natural features are an exciting and challenging change that will hopefully increase public awareness in such areas in our increasingly human-dominated landscape. I hope, too, that somewhere down the road, these changes will also lead to an increased protection of the few outstanding natural areas that remain in southern Ontario, and that their conservation will proceed in a thoughtful and progressive manner. Although my topic this evening is the Creditview wetland and its attributes, I would like to begin with a broader consideration of the qualities upon which natural areas are evaluated and the significance that is attached to those areas here in Ontario. The identification and evaluation of natural areas goes back a long way. Indeed, some of the most spectacular of these areas provided the impetus for the National Parks Program, which had its start in 1885 with the reservation of some lands around the mineral hot springs near Banff, Alberta. Similar considerations prompted the Ontario government to embark upon a program of park creation. And in 1893, the first provincial park, Algonquin Park, was designated. However, between those early days and the idea, when the idea of lands set aside as parks was just being implemented, and the present, when the undeveloped land base is shrinking across southern Ontario at a precipitous pace, many advances in our understanding of the land and its natural resources, including biological features and elements, have occurred. The process of identifying significant natural areas has been put on a more objective basis, and the comparison of such areas has been made more defensible and more understandable. The Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources has been pursuing a goal of province-wide examination and identification of valued natural areas. They're known to the Ministry as areas of natural and scientific interest. ANSIs in the ever-growing vocabulary of acronyms. The Ministry uses a system of eco-zones and eco-districts, a system that unfortunately has not been as well researched and as well grounded as we might wish, but which I do not want to take too much time in explaining and describing. Based on the work by Angus Hills, who was in the Faculty of Forestry at the University of Toronto, the province has been divided into 14 zones. And this is a figure showing the province of Ontario in the 14 zones that Angus Hill initially recognized. These are zones where the influences of climate are considered to be more or less uniform upon the biological elements that are present in those zones. The Ministry of Natural Resources has called these regions site regions. And if you'll notice, there are 7 going from north to south, and then there are 3 going from east to west. They tally up to 14. Within each of these site regions, the ministry has designated or recognized certain site districts. These are smaller eco-districts, and they've been created in part by an overlay of physiographic regions that were identified by Lyman Chapman and David Putnam in their classic work on the physiography of southern Ontario, with these original site regions, which were first defined by Angus Hills. And if you'll notice, the dashed line at the bottom identifies Site Region 7. That's the area in which Mississauga is located, and the area in which about 75 to 80% of the population of Ontario also lives. And the area that's marked 4, that is Site District 7-4, is the area in which Mississauga is found. This is called the Site District. Now, for a variety of administrative, pragmatic, and technical reasons, the boundaries of the site regions and site districts are slightly different from those that were originally described by either Hills or Chapman and Putnam. However, what is most germane to your understanding of what follows is that this southernmost ecozone, Site Region 7, accommodates 75 to 80% of the population of the province and includes most of the lands in the greater Toronto area, including all of Mississauga. Biologically, this southernmost ecozone is the richest in the province, having the largest total number of species of plants and animals. This ecozone also has the largest concentration of rare and unusual species, particularly vascular plants that are at the northern limits of their range here in southern Ontario. We're in the fortunate position of being one of the most southernmost land masses in Canada, and as a result there are a number of species which are more widely distributed in the United States, and they find the limits of their northern range here in southern Ontario. The presence of this large number of species that are more abundant south of the international boundary has led to the designation of Site Region 7 as a Carolinian zone in Ontario. The relatively mild climate and productive soils of Site Region 7 did not go unnoticed by settlers to Upper Canada. And today, natural areas in this ecozone of the province are more or less isolated remnants of a forest and glade landscape that once stretched from the Detroit River near Windsor to Duffins Creek in Pickering. The identification of significant natural features within this heavily settled and intensively developed landscape is very much a matter of visualizing or revisualizing the landscape and its features as it might have appeared to Samuel de Champlain, or even better, to the unknown Neutral and Huron Aboriginals who first traversed these lands, and they were cloaked in their primal vegetation. This does not mean that plant communities were undisturbed back then, but that the disturbance factors were not of human origin, and they were not introduced or applied deliberately to alter or eliminate the existing vegetation. It also means identifying or recognizing landforms, ecological units, and plant communities that have not been altered by human activities subsequent to the widespread settlement of southern Ontario, or those communities and ecosystems that are among the least altered of those that remain with us today. To make this evaluation within each of the eco-districts in a site region, the Ministry of Natural Resources has been employing 5 criteria. The first is representation of pre-settlement natural features. The second, diversity of features and habitats within a given area. The third, condition with respect to disturbance and or modification. The fourth are ecological considerations, such as size, shape, adjacent land uses, and watershed location. And finally, the 5th criterion has been special features, such as rare or unusual elements. Certain wildlife considerations, such as stopovers from migratory birds, or the nesting areas of colonial birds. Because knowledge of special features often requires extensive field work in a given area, the 5th criterion is generally employed only after all natural areas in a given category have been screened using the first 4 criteria. The result has been a series of ministry-issued documents identifying and discussing the selection of ANSIs within the various eco-districts of Southern Ontario. However, despite the considerable study that went into those documents, no sooner had they been issued than it was realized that a relatively large number of significant areas in Site Region 7 had not received the recognition that they deserved. A new initiative was mounted to identify the so-called critical unprotected areas of Carolinian Canada, and a new report was issued identifying some additional 35 areas. And so it goes, because even after that report had been issued, additional areas were later discovered that did not receive recognition. However, I don't want to spend a great deal of time talking about how thorough the natural area screening process was. What I do want to emphasize that by the 5 criteria that are used by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, the Creditview Wetland would rate very highly as a remnant natural area. It would probably be considered an area of at least regional and very likely provincial significance. It provides representation of natural features that have existed on that site since the end of the most recent glacial episode, some 12,000 to 14,000 years ago. For its size, it has a great diversity of plant communities and habitats. At least 6 distinctive vegetation types have been identified in the wetland. At the time of its discovery in 1987, the wetland itself was in remarkably good condition. No debris or litter was present in the wetland. The number of non-native plants was relatively low, and no indication of degraded water quality was observed. Most of the catchment basin had been cleared for agricultural use, but a fringe of shrubs and small trees was present along most of the wetland edge, and very few agricultural species had invaded the wetland. Located in the headwater region of Chapel Creek, the wetland receives only surface runoff inputs. It is quite small, but its tear shape makes it relatively compact. Because of its hybrid organic soils, many of the non-native species of surrounding lands cannot invade the plant communities present in the wetland. The Creditview Wetland supports 18 regionally significant vascular plants, 3 significant species of birds, and at least 3 significant plant communities. The combination of those factors would give it an extremely high rating in the Ministry's areas of natural and scientific interest program. Now, I'm sure you all know Mississauga, but I put up a map just to show you precisely where the Creditview Wetland is located. It's located on the northeast corner of Eglinton and Creditview Road, set somewhat back from the road itself. The Creditview Wetland is a 4.5 hectare, that's 11-acre wetland, northeast of the intersection of Eglinton and Creditview Roads. It is situated in the deep end of a shallow flute in the post-glacial plain that occupies the northern two-thirds.
Can people see that all right, or do you have any more of those? All right?
It is situated in the deep end of a shallow flute in the post-glacial plain that occupies the northern two-thirds of the city of Mississauga. Underlain by dense gray clay, the wetland represents a superficial feature that is perched above and isolated from the groundwater system. The catchment basin of the wetland is 11 hectares, that is 27 acres, and it is relatively clearly distinguished as a horseshoe-shaped crest around the tear-shaped basin. This contour line here, somewhere actually between these two contour lines, represents the actual area of the catchment basin. You can see there a spot elevation of 168.5, and here 165. So almost immediately, the ground surface begins to fall off away from the wetland basin. A glacial flute is a rather shallow, narrow hummock swale that's been carved into the ground moraine that exists in that area. The particular cause of the fluting is not entirely certain, but it's believed that at some point glacial movement in a northeast southwest direction occurred to create some of these, and there are a series of hollows that, actually a hollow in crest topography that runs parallel to this particular feature. The deepest end is here at the northwest, and then the shallowest portion here at the southeast. And this represents the drainage into Chapel Creek. The dashed line signifies that it's seasonal, and in fact there has been, during this recent historic past, a causeway built at that point to further impound water in this basin here. Plants of the Creditview wetland, like the plants in any natural area, are grouped into a number of distinctive assemblages, generally referred to as communities. Plant communities are distinguished by the appearance of the principal species, such as trees or shrubs, as well as the identities of the most abundant or most important species. The particular communities and constituent species in a given area are initially determined by physical factors, the most important of which is climate. That harkens back to the classification of site districts, site regions, that was performed by the Ministry of Natural Resources. After climate, sunlight is the most important environmental factor for vascular plants, since they use the energy of light to make their food. After sunlight, other critical factors are water and various elemental nutrients, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. Once plant communities are established in a given area, they begin to produce subtle changes in the physical environment that permit both structural and compositional changes in the resident plant communities. Organic matter and plant nutrients accumulate in the substrate. The climate near the ground is altered, becoming slightly less windy and more humid during the growing season. In a wetland where the water table remains relatively high through the growing season and seasonal flushing is moderate or lacking, the buildup of partly decayed plant materials, that is, peat, may occur. As these changes in soil conditions occur, and as a plant community ages, new plants that were initially unable to grow in the site may appear, and finding the altered conditions to their liking, they may prosper and replace earlier colonists. One of the big unresolved arguments of plant ecology is whether this process stable environmental, a subtle environmental alteration and consequent shift in plant community composition reaches some ultimately stable community that is in long-term equilibrium with environmental conditions. The jury is still out on this matter. It will be a long time yet before a decision is reached. However, the idea of community session is one that enjoys great popularity with progressive Darwinians. To get back to the Creditview wetland, 6 vegetation types have been distinguished, partly based on the appearance of plants and partly on their position within the wetland. These are, and they're indicated on the bottom here, although I'll give them in a slightly different order. Swamp communities are found here and here. Shallow marsh found in small sections of the perimeter, around the perimeter of the wetland. Meadow marsh found in this region, although not distinguished as such, also present in this part of this community. Aquatic communities found throughout the areas labeled 6. And 2 communities which I'll mention only briefly. One, the dryland thicket, which is present along most of this portion of the wetland edge, and the woodland fringe, which both of these have a mosaic appearance around the edge of the basin. So they alternate to some extent. Sometimes fringe, sometimes thicket is present. A swamp is a wetland dominated by woody plants, and 2 types of swamps are present in Creditview: hardwood swamp and thicket swamp. Switch to slides at this point.
2 seconds.
The swamp is dominated by large tree-sized willows. And this is an early spring shot. The large tree-sized willows are visible just in the background as naked stems that stick up above the horizon. The thicket swamp has been separated into 2 communities, one of shrub-sized willows and the other a mix of shrubs. Can't exist side by side. What I'll do is, after I've run through some of these slides, maybe I'll switch back to the overhead just to show you once again where those particular communities were located.
Are we standing on the north end of this?
This is the north end looking south. The greatest slope occurs at the north end of the basin, and the largest area of open water is directly below that slope. The thicket swamp has been separated into 2 communities, one of shrub-sized willow and the other a mix of shrubs, including both willows, chokeberry, winterberry, and swamp rose, with scattered tamarack. These communities are present on the central island of the wetland. A variation of the thicket swamp has also been distinguished as the shrub-dominated hummocks. Those are shrub-dominated hummocks. Tiny separated islands that in most cases support isolated shrubs. The hummocks usually support only 1 or 2 shrubs, and they're scattered around the edge of the wetland basin. Several shallow marsh communities have been distinguished, including discrete patches dominated by common cattail, by common burreed, and by reed canary grass. Again, this is an early spring shot. You can see just a small patch of the burreed community there, and another patch occurs right here. These species are robust emergents that often grow in almost monospecific stems. That is, they grow with few other species. These communities are confined to the edge of the wetland basin. And this is a picture looking at the central shrub thicket over there, and some of the isolated hummocks are present here. This is actually a finger of the central island. The central island forks as a Y shape, and this is the easternmost arm of that particular island, and facing southeast in this particular distance. The Meadow Marsh occurs on the shoreline of the wetland basin in areas that are flooded at least through the spring of each year. They are dominated by grass-like plants, primarily known as rhamnoids, that are of relatively low stature, such as creeping bent creeping bent grass and spike brush. The aquatic communities are found submerged in the open water or floating on the surface. And that is mat duckweed that is floating on the surface of the water. The dominant species is duckweed, and as the growing season progresses, a nearly continuous film of this floating vascular plant can cover the open water of the wetland. It is not to be confused with the odorous film of algae that sometimes forms on sewage lagoons and is familiarly known as pond scum. Finally, there is a diverse mosaic of community fragments on the dry sections of the wetland shore. Most stretches are occupied by thickets of brambles, mostly raspberries, or a narrow fringe of hawthorns. But there is also a grove of black locust trees and a patch or two of four-bridged grassland present on the western shore. You can't see very much of it, but that is a little bit of the fringe of dryland thicket that's present along different sections of the shore. Here's another view. This one was actually taken from on the wetland looking to the shore. There's a large bur oak that is served as a marker. It stands above the actual basin itself, which is quite distinct at that particular portion of its edge. And it falls off fairly rapidly to a height of about 2 to 3 meters. And again, you can see some of the hummocks here. And this is the film of lemna, or duckweed, that fills up as the season progresses. A total of 134 different species of vascular plants have been identified in the Creditview wetland. And only about 21 of these are non-native species. This represents about 16% of the Creditview wetland flora, and that proportion is an extremely low one. The low proportion of non-natives is all the more remarkable when the location of the Creditview wetland is taken into account, in the middle of a relatively urbanized area. In most remnant natural areas in Mississauga, the proportion of non-natives approaches about 30% or even higher. Of the 134 species of vascular plants in the Creditview wetland, 16 species are present in Mississauga only at this location. 12 species are relatively rare in the regional municipality of Peel, having fewer than 4 other known locations in the region. 4 species, the smooth gooseberry, which is a small shrub, the swamp rose, which is related to our cultivated roses, the swamp blackberry, which is related to raspberry, and the Virginia chain fern, which is a fern, are known from were known from other locations in Peel, but they have not been relocated at those locations since the early 1980s. The stations of Creditview may be the last in Peel region for these species. However, the vegetation and plants are not the only valued attributes of the Creditview wetland. Perhaps I'll just take a break from the prepared material to run through a few more of these slides. That the trees in the background are the tamaracks, and they're in a surrounding of willows. These are willows. In the foreground we have some eastern cottonwood, and I have a suspicion that that's actually on the dryland portion of the wetland. So we've got a telephoto lens here. The perspective is somewhat compressed. The focus doesn't seem to be responding. There's perhaps the largest of the tamaracks standing up above the willows there.
Tamarack coniferous, is it?
Yes, it's a conifer. It's an unusual conifer. I have a picture a little later on of a close-up, but this is a deciduous conifer, which means that in winter it will lose its leaves and become a naked stem. Each fall the needles turn quite a bright yellow and are lost. And then each spring they grow just as our maples and oak trees produce a new set of leaves. Tamarack. Tamarisk is a woody shrub, actually, that we used to have one in our garden. Has very fine leaves that look a little bit like conifer needles, but you'll see when I show you the close-up, the tamarack is a native tree in Ontario, primarily found in wetlands. So in northern Ontario, often associated with peatlands. This gives you an idea of what the interior of the shrub thicket, or thicket swamp looks like. The ferns, these are all ferns here, are royal ferns, and the shrubs are willows. And this is one of the significant communities present at the Creditview wetland. Professor Paul Maycock is a vegetation ecologist at Arundel, and he was out to look at this particular site. And it's his opinion that this is the only occurrence of this particular community, this royal fern willow thicket community in Ontario. This is a look at one of the hummocks, and in this particular instance, this hummock has built up on a fallen log, a stump actually. A number of the hummocks that appear to have formed on cut conifer stumps, and it has been related to us that somewhere in the early part of this century, the local farmer may have been in there harvesting some large white pines that had grown up in the basin. In the background, you can see a little bit of these swamp rose. I have a close-up of it, but it produces these very attractive pink flowers. There's actually another one right at the edge there. Again, most of the shrubs are willows that we can see here, but at the south end of the central island, the mix of species becomes much more diverse, and willows are no longer the dominant. This right here in the foreground is a willow. This is a close-up of one of the hummocks, and what we can see is the considerable abundance of ferns. This is Marsh Fern, and again, the focus is a little bit off here. Very typically on these hummocks, there are one or two shrubs which, because of their interception of light, are considered to be the dominant species. They have woody stems, and they produce a canopy which generally shades. That's great, thank you. Shades the plants which grow on the actual surface of the soil, ground cover. And in this particular instance, the dominant species is marsh fern, but you can also see some wild iris here. as well as this is called marsh cinquefoil. And in among them, we have an almost continuous carpet of mosses. That's what this kind of browny green material is. So that, and then around here, I should also mention, this is a rather late season view. We've had a drop in water level from probably somewhere around here down to here at this particular point in time. And considerable buildup of duckweed on the surface, water surface. Both water drawdown and the increasing buildup of plant biomass are regular features of seasonal progression in wetlands. So there's a certain loss of water through evaporation, through a process called transpiration, whereby the plants take up water and it's lost to the atmosphere, and also a natural drainage along any existing gradients. And then we have buildup of biomass so that the duckweed, for example, which begins as a few isolated patches on the surface of the water, reproduce, multiply very quickly in a vegetative fashion, and very quickly cover the entire surface of the pond. Another view of a hummock, this one dominated by a plant called red osier. And again, the drop in water level is quite clearly evident, and the surrounding of the duckweed is kind of a film on the water. This is a picture of the community with robust emergence. These are the common bird reeds, and this is the meadow marsh, which occurs in areas that are usually flooded a little bit longer, so they're a little further out towards the actual surface of the water. And in this particular case, the most abundant species is a spike brush, a very diminutive thin plant which has a somewhat grass-like appearance. Now, there's a bird there, unfortunately not very well evident, but that's one of the wading birds. I believe that particular bird was a greenbacked heron. I'm not entirely certain. I wasn't able to locate that on that particular thing. The surface has a very peculiar appearance because of the duckweed, and what we're getting is a very high reflection off the vegetation. I put this one in. This is a very early spring photograph before anything is developed, because it shows some of the patterns that I've described a little more clearly. Here's the emergent marsh, the shallow marsh with the graminoids, the grass-like plants that are quite robust. Those in the background are cattails, and these up here are reed canary grass. And then in back we can see the shrub thickets on the hummocks. And then way in the background, these are the tamaracks. And there are also a few scattered hardwood trees present, mostly red maples on that central island. And I believe those are actually canopy geese over there, but there's a better picture of canopy geese. Here's a view into the emergent marsh community. Most of those leaves belong to bird reed, but the flowers are the blue flag or wild iris that is present in most wetlands in southern Ontario.
Is that new?
Yes, it is. In the summer of 1988, I believe it was, we had an extremely unusual situation. It was an extremely dry year. And the result was that the wetland dried out almost to the central island. So there's a moat that exists around the central island, and it's generally flooded with several feet of water. But this particular year, dried almost to the point where it appeared you would walk over. Now, this is the moat area. It's still actually quite wet, so that to have walked over required wading through about 2 feet of oozy muck. But it illustrates very nicely the development of this Meadow Marsh, which is a wetland community that often develops in the absence of competition from some of the more robust species. And because of the dry conditions, it was able to extend itself right across this relatively open area of mucky organic material. Again, the tamaracks in the background. This is a rather late season photograph, so that most of the willows have begun to turn color. And there's a red maple that's also showing its typical maple red color. But the tamaracks are still maintaining a green, or they will very shortly turn yellow. This is a close-up of the Meadow Marsh community. A number of broadleaf things will grow in there as well. This is called a burr marigold, or sorry, Vegetation. And you can see the mucky ooze that is present between each of these clumps of spike brush. Another very early spring shot. This is again, this shows the reed canary grass marsh that's present in the little patch on the west shore of the wetland. Summer photograph. This is an early spring, or perhaps I should say early summer picture, showing the absence of duckweed in the open water, but by the end of August, that has managed to fill most of that area. And then it blows back and forth at the vagaries of the wind. There's a picture in late August, or perhaps in early September, that summer of 1988, when the water portion was quite considerably reduced. Exposed mud flats. Lemna, although it's a very diminutive plant, actually overwinters as it's perennial, so that what happens is much of the frond dies back, but there's a little bud that can overwinter as living cells, and then it gets a very quick start as soon as the weather warms up above about 10 to 12 degrees. So that even now, this duckweed growing out there in the wetland. Some of the plants that are present are this beggar's ticks, which produces a very attractive yellow flower and grows into quite considerable masses in some sections of the shoreline. There are some painted turtles. A count of as many as 65 turtles have been made in the wetland, so the population is an incredibly large one for the size of the area. There are the camping geese, present in greatest abundance at this time of the year, although as the season progresses, only 1 or 2 pairs will actually remain on the wetland to nest. There's a picture of a tamarack. You can see the whorls of needles that come off on the small spur branches. In early spring, these will first appear and then remain through the summer and fall and late September. This is the chokeberry, a relative of the cherry family, and one of the rare species that's present in the Creditview Wetland. This is the only location of this particular species in Mississauga, although it is present up in the north end of the field. This is the swamp rose. Although the flowers are relatively showy, they're not the double flowers of the cultivated varieties. This is the Winterberry, also a fairly common wetland plant in the more northern regions of the province, and also found in the northern end of Peel, but only at this location in Mississauga. This is the chain fern. This is one of the species which is only known presently from Creditview Wetland in the region of Peel. Very primitive and unusual fern that produces a continuous row of spores, spore-bearing parts on the inner surface of the leaf. This is the burreed, the common burreed. It gets its name from those large clumps of fruit which have spiky points sticking off them, hence the name burr. This is the beggar stick. Produces large masses of yellow flowers in some parts of the wetland shore. This is another plant that's found in the wetland. This is called wild cucumber. And it's a vine that produces these relatively delicate white flowers, but late in the season produces a somewhat spiny and very fleshy fruit, which is related rather distantly to our cultivated cucumber. This is a species, a little plant called jewelweed or spotted jewelweed, and has a very attractive flower late in the season and produces fruits which will explode if they're held in your hand. And so another name that these are the fruits just beginning to develop. Another name that is common to this particular plant is touch-me-not. It has a central rib between the halves of the fruit, and that central rib becomes very tightly stretched as the fruit swells up and matures. And then it becomes very sensitive to changes in humidity. So when you hold it between your fingers, the heat generated by your hand will cause that central rib to dry. And under as it dries out, it contracts. And that's what causes some explosive discharge of seeds. And that's how that particular plant manages to spread its seeds around, because it's an annual. So it has to start from seed every year again. And this is the swamp milkweed, which grows in some scattered clumps around the wetland.
Did you call that jump hogweed?
No, the hogweed is a different species. I'll go back to it in a moment. Just mention the difference between that and jump hogweed.
Can you tell me why the milkweed is on the noxious weeds list from Mississauga, when it's a butterfly plant that keeps our marsh alive?
That particular one is the swamp milkweed. The milkweed that's on the noxious weed plant is a weed of agricultural field. It's called the common milkweed.
There's none of the butterflies?
Well, the monarch butterfly does, yes.
Can't survive with it?
The Noxious Weed Act is something that was drafted, I believe, in about 1930, and it was very strongly influenced by agricultural considerations. Now, they're supposed to actually be revisiting the species that are on that list.
But this should just read in Streetsville. I heard the Mississauga News, and I sort of wrote down and thought,
yes, well, I guess there was a lot more concern for agricultural fields than there was monarch butterflies in 1930. I can't say that there necessarily will be any changes to that list.
Yeah.
They are supposed to be reviewing the things that are on it. Okay. However, vegetation and plants are not the only valued attributes of the Creditview wetland, though they are the ones to which most of the significance is attached by specialists such as myself. And of course, they provide the habitat for most of the wildlife. The wetland is also home to a fairly diverse group of animals, including mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. Among the more common mammals seen here have been the eastern cottontail and the raccoon, but muskrat and white-tailed deer have also been seen in and around the wetland basin. Signs of coyote have been seen on the central island and on several of the hummocks. And in the winter of 1989, one visitor to the wetland was not lucky enough to actually videotape a coyote coming out of the brush surrounding the basin. A total of 82 species of birds have been observed in and around the Creditview wetland, of which about 10 appear to nest in the area. The nesting species include the mallard, the downy woodpecker, the red-winged blackbird, the northern oriole, and the song sparrow, among others. In mid to late summer, great blue heron can be seen foraging in the wetland. And I myself have been present when no less than 6 great blues and 1 greenback heron were in the wetland. During the summer of 1988, a count of 65 Midland painted turtles was made during one afternoon. And there may well be more that were not seen at that time. A snapping turtle has been observed in the wetland on several occasions, as well as the occasional garter snake. All of the common frogs of southern Ontario have been seen in the wetland, including spring peepers, tree frogs, and leopard frogs. All can be heard singing at this time of the year. A rich assemblage of aquatic and semi-aquatic invertebrates is present in Creditview wetland, but among the most distinctive is the burrowing crayfish. This diminutive relative of the lobster lives in wet burrows that it excavates near the water's edge. Around the mouth of each burrow, it builds a chimney that makes a distinctive cone which stands up above the surrounding ground level. By day, it hides at the bottom of this burrow. By night, it ventures out into the water of the wetland pond to forage for food and chat out other burrowing crayfish. There are hundreds of stories that can be told about the biota of the Creditview wetland. How each species has carved out its own living space and exploits the resources around it. How each individual must struggle to obtain the nutrients that it needs while avoiding the fate of becoming a food for another organism. The business of life in the wetland is a complex but endlessly fascinating one. I haven't even begun to scratch the surface. After the consideration of each individual species, there are the various interactions to consider. Things like energy and nutrient transfers, the food webs, and the various ways in which different species utilize the plants that are in the wetland for food and shelter, and how the plants attempt to defend themselves from overexploitation. However, I would like to conclude with a brief consideration of the relatively recent discovery of the Creditview wetland and what that means for remnant natural areas here in Mississauga and across southern Ontario. Despite the provincial screening that went on during the identification of areas of natural and scientific interest, and despite the surveying that went on during the study of environmentally significant areas within the Creditview watershed, the Creditview wetland is not identified as a significant area, or even noticed as being in existence. It first came to the attention of individuals who recognized its potential values in 1987. And since then, it has been an uphill struggle to get the attention of those who put the official seals on such areas, to get them to notice this one and grudgingly give it the recognition that is its due. Lying in a hollow that is, or was when farmlands surrounded it, tucked away from general view, being rather small and having no distinctive signature on aerial photographs or topographic maps, the area was not visited by individuals with the appropriate background. Once the significance of the area became a matter of some public controversy, quite a number of people came forward to say that they had known of the area for many years, mostly that they had skated on the pond in winter. But in a rural agricultural landscape, no one had given the biological resources of this area much thought. The local farmers may have regretted that it was too deep to easily drain and to put into agricultural production, but few, if any, other thoughts were given to it. However, as the blade of the bulldozer prepared to reshape the local landscape of the Creditview Wetland, natural environment surveyors were sent to examine the features that would be lost. It is altogether appropriate that such careful and thorough surveys be conducted because such areas, once lost, will never again be recreated as they presently exist. Ponds may be dug and model wetlands may be constructed, but the unique assemblage of land, water, and biological elements that is present in an area like the Creditview Wetland will never be put together by the hand of man, given our current and foreseeable state of knowledge. The survey and assessment of natural areas is not a simple matter of measuring the outer boundaries and of determining the area that is occupied. Nor can you look in a book under any system of geographic coordinates or place names or biological species names and find there the data to tell you whether this or that remnant natural area is significant, whether it has features that are representative of conditions that existed 100 or 5,000 years ago, whether it has a diverse or unusually varied range of communities and habitats, whether the disturbances to which it has been subjected have seriously imperiled its quality, or whether it has escaped from those disturbances in a relatively intact condition, whether its elements are relatively rare, or whether it is dominated by aggressive invaders of relatively recent appearance. These determinations require expertise and more than a little research. They require a breadth of experience within natural areas and the most thorough scrutiny in the field that time permits to each area that is being considered. The Creditview Wetland is presently rated as a Class 3 wetland, which means it is considered provincially significant by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. My reason for touching briefly on the Ministry's criteria for significant natural areas is to demonstrate that this wetland also fulfills all of the ANSI criteria and fulfills them very well. It should probably be recognized under that program as well as the wetland program. Creditview Wetland is one of a handful of wetlands in the southernmost provincial ecozone that contains peatland. It has peatland plant communities that are not found in any of these other southern bogs. It has a remarkably large assemblage of locally rare vascular plants. It represents a unique natural heritage feature in the City of Mississauga. Thank you. I'm going to just put up the list of rare or unusual species that are present in the wetland and very briefly run through them. My intention is not to confound you with the names or the particular significances of those species. Several papers have actually been produced on the significant features of the Creditview Wetland. I've brought copies so that you can take a look at them if you like. We saw a picture of the chokeberry. It's rare in Peel region, and this is its only record for the City of Mississauga. You can see its own present Teapot Lake, which is a small feature just north of Heart Lake in Brampton. It's other species that are rare in Peel are the amethyst aster, the heath aster, a sedge. This is a small grass-like plant, actually a couple of sedges. There's the smooth gooseberry. It was last seen at Heart Lake in 1891, and this is currently its only known location in Mississauga and Peel region.
What is that berry from the traditional gooseberry that we know?
Well, it's quite similar, except that wild gooseberries are much smaller and generally quite a bit tardy, although the garden gooseberry is also quite astringent. The swamp rose is another one of those species that was last seen at the turn of the century. There's the swamp blackberry, last collected in 1910 at Snellgrove, now in Brampton. High bush blueberry, which is only present at Teapot Lake, and so on. These are the species which are presently known in Mississauga only at this location. There's the Virginia chain fern, apparently now extinct at Teapot Lake, so presently known in Mississauga only from the Creditview Wetland. To refresh your memory, we saw a picture of the Virginia chain fern, of the swamp rose, the royal fern, and the chokeberry. Oh, sorry. Vascular plants are plants which have water-conducting systems in them, as we have blood vessels. So some plants must live right in water because they don't have any ability to transport water through their stems. However, trees are vascular plants. They have a system of vessels, tubes in them, that allow them to carry water right up to the canopy, the leaves at the top of the stem. And by the same token, they can send nutrients down to the roots, so that all plants need to circulate food through their bodies. Just as blood circulates through our bodies, vascular plants circulate water and nutrients through their bodies to nourish.
You should have a vascular system. What would it have as an alternative?
Well, if it doesn't have a vascular system, then it grows in water or right on the ground. Mosses have a very primitive system of transport, so that they, as a result, must grow very close to the ground, so that almost all of the cells are near water. And water is the medium that plants use to transport things around. So unlike our bodies, which have a closed system used to utilize blood, most plants use water to conduct nutrients back and forth. And also, of course, water is essential to the life process. So that leaves can't drink, but they can get the water through this vascular system. Okay, I don't know if anybody wants to continue to stare at that. As I say, I do have some copies of that. I was just going to go back to that last photograph and make a mention of milkweed. Joe Pyeweed is a relative of the daisy, and it has what we call a compound inflorescence. So that in swamp milkweed, each of these is an individual flower. And if an insect comes to visit, it will visit that individual flower and then move to another individual flower. Now, if we go back a little bit, okay, that is a member of the daisy family or the aster family, and that's the same family to which Joe Pyeweed belongs. Each of those petals is not a petal but a flower, and a large number of very tiny flowers, some of which have long strap-shaped petals, if you will, and some of which have tiny cone-shaped petals, are aggregated into a compound inflorescence or head. And if we were to take this apart, we would find that there are two types of flowers present in this inflorescence. There are these long strap-shaped flowers, which form the outer rim of the daisy, or in this case, the beggar tick. And then there are a number of small central flowers, which are just tubes, tiny little tubes, which end in a series of little points, which are remnants of the individual petals. And the distinction between Joe Piley and swamp milkweed is based on those differences in the flower. Okay, I'll be happy to entertain any particular questions about what I discussed, or any of the other questions you'd like about natural areas here in Ontario. In 1988, when the matter of Creditview Wetland was first brought to our attention, a report was produced for the South Peel Naturalists Club, by the South Peel Naturalists Club. And it's from that report that I've taken most of the material that I've presented here. The original, who we first contacted about this particular presentation was Jocelyn Weber, and she's produced a book on the flora, the vascular plant flora of Peel region, Peel County, I should say. She started before the county became a region, and she didn't want to change things around with the small additions that were made, so the boundaries that she uses are Peel County. It was her knowledge of the vascular plant flora of Peel region which first prompted her to get involved in the effort to see this area saved. She very quickly realized that quite a number of the plants that were present in the area were relatively significant in the Peel region. And then in 1990, at a conference on wetlands of the Great Lakes, we made a presentation which provided some of the history of the struggle with the Ministry of Natural Resources that went on to have this area reassessed using the wetland classification system or wetland evaluation system that's in present use in southern Ontario. One of the reasons that the development around the Creditview wetland initially proceeded was that the wetland area itself was given a very low rating in the wetland evaluation, and as a result of repeated discussions with and evaluations, data collection that went on during the early period during which the fate of the Creditview wetland is very much up in the air. As a result of that work, a reassessment took place. In fact, several reassessments took place. And the evaluation of the Creditview wetland went from class 7 to class 6 to class 5, and ultimately ended up in class 3.
Why was it so low in the first place?
Well, it was a reflection of the relative inexperience of the original surveyors. The system is a fairly technical one, and I didn't bring the manual along, but anybody that wants to get into it can get a copy of the manual from the Ministry of Natural Resources. And a certain amount of training is supposed to occur to enable each of the evaluators to use that system. However, like many another government program, the initial design called for about a 2-week training program involving a field camp at which all of the prospective evaluators would go off and get a lot of hands-on experience with wetlands. And what happened was that after the first, I don't even know if it made it through the first year, but certainly after the first year, the training program was cut down to about 3 days. And the amount of experience that the evaluators were able to get in that 3-day period was extremely limited, especially with respect to field work. So what happened was that when they went out to the area, although they were struck by some of the unusual plants, they didn't recognize that there was a peatland in the area. The central island is actually made of peat, and that particular deposit represents 30%, or about 33% of all of the peat that is present in Peel region. So on that basis alone, it was given a considerable addition of points, and that moved its evaluation score up to, I think, a class 6. And then when some additional species that were considered significant in the wetland evaluation system were identified and demonstrated to be there, that moved its classification up an additional number of points. And the sort of icing on the cake came when we were arguing over whether or not it merited a class 3 evaluation. The people at Queen's Park were very reluctant, and so they decided they needed to send one of their own people out to look at this area. When he got out there, he was actually fortunate enough to see 2 additional species that were considered to be provincially significant. So that really boosted the rating up to class 3. Now, we've had, the fighting, I guess, has sort of died down, but when this matter was very hot, we had some additional fights over a few other points. The area is right now about 2 points short of being a class 2 wetland. And at the time, there was a great divide between class 3 wetlands and class 2 wetlands. In 1989, a class 2 wetland was provincially significant, and a class 3 wetland was regionally significant. And there was a very great reluctance on the part of the people of the ministry to elevate this thing to provincial significance. So we weren't able to get anybody to agree that those additional 2 points should be awarded, although we were attacking them on several fronts, all of which amounted to a difference of about 8 points. Anyway, in the interim, the point became moot because the new wetlands policy, which was released in 1992, I believe, made both class 1, class 2, and class 3 wetlands provincially significant. So the specifics of whether it was 1 or 2 or 3 were actually no longer meaningful because it is now recognized as provincially significant.
Does that mean they'll say?
No, that doesn't. That means it's provincially significant.
Just identify.
That's right. The question of saving any natural area. I mean, I've mentioned the areas of natural and scientific interest program and the wetland program, and the proposed changes to the Ontario Heritage Act. But none of those programs, none of that legislation has in it a mechanism to save these areas. So the fight to save any of those sites will have to be fought one at a time on each specific issue. It's the same as with any of the architectural heritage resources. There is a mechanism to recognize and identify these areas, but negotiations must be held with each landowner and each property owner to secure the protection of those areas.
Jeff, could I just ask the question then? You've been involved since 91, 92, 93 in the preservation, the rezoning, and even tonight modifications to the official plan that would bring some of the provincial policy. And I just wanted, if you might comment on that, because you were actively involved in working towards that. Are you confident that, one, that it can be preserved, and two, what would you say should occur in order that its significance would be more broadly known by people in the neighborhood, by people in Mississauga? Generally, it's through the knowledge of people of its significance that something is preserved. It's not through government edict. If you might just comment on that.
Well, I'm not at all confident that it's going to be preserved. I think the the city's stepped into the vacuum, but the provincial government has certainly backed away from getting involved in this issue, and I think that's very unfortunate. There really appears to be something of a gap between the pronouncements that are coming out of the provincial government and the actions that are coming out of them. They are walking tall, but they're acting small. What I'm saying is that they're toughening certain legislation. They're taking a very proactive approach on a variety of environmental fronts, but they're not really backing any of that activism up with much in the way of commitment with respect to money or manpower. And I think the result is that a vacuum does exist in that area between the legislative or legal pronouncements and whether or not these areas actually will have that be successfully preserved or conserved. I think that sort of situation has been recognized by a number of developers, and what they've done is they've taken actions which have resulted in a lot of public hue and cry, but which have permitted them to carry out their own plans. There was a much publicized case in Ottawa where a wetland was bulldozed for a golf course, and I think the developer was fined about $50,000, but in the face of a multi-million-dollar project, that was probably insignificant, and in fact didn't even represent perhaps a fifth of the cost of going to something like an Ontario Municipal Board hearing, where legal fees can quickly mount up into hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think there is a serious possibility that more than a few of these areas are going to be lost to various development pressures. Now, in terms of elevating the profile of some of these areas, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm quite keen to make a presentation such as this one. I think there are very good models that exist to publicize these things. I know the Credit Valley Conservation Authority has a school package which is sent out on, for example, Rattray Marsh, in which they talk about some of the various biological elements of the marsh. They talk about its relation to the water regime, some of the factors that went into shaping that particular area as it presently exists. And I think that those kinds of public information packages are extremely useful. They make school groups aware of them. They make any other individuals or scout troops, for example, that are interested in investigating some of these resources more aware of their significance and of their value to the local community. But certainly, I'd like to see the people, either the Credit Valley Conservation Authority or the city, produce some kind of booklet on some of the natural areas here in Mississauga. I think that would be a very valuable bit of material to have to send out to scout troops or to classrooms when they're planning units on things like perhaps Canadian wildlife or wetlands or whatever it might be. Yes.
Well, in the case of the wetlands right now, public awareness is going to help the image of the whole thing, but like what route does it go? Are we just, does the wetland exist now only from the goodwill of the developer that he doesn't, in other words, the flack has caused them to slow down?
Well, a number of things have caused them to slow down. One thing, of course, has been the economic slowdown. I suspect that if it had still been boom times as it was in 1987 and 1988, he'd be, have everybody up at Supreme Court or wherever he was going to go to push his project through. Because things fell down economically, stalled so dramatically, I think he was relatively happy to just let it sit and proceed with his planning and the redesign that he's done. Certainly the fellow that owns the north half of it has been quite reasonable in terms of recognizing the concern that was surrounded this particular area and being willing to redesign what he had planned to leave it intact. But it was all left that the city, the provincial government, and the developers were going to sit down and have some kind of final negotiation to determine whether or not the developers merited or wanted some kind of additional compensation, and just what amount of compensation they were going to receive if that was the case. The developer, when they last rode off into the sunset, were talking about a $12 million value that they placed on the lost development frontage that they had to forego as a result of preserving that area. What that figure certainly shrank very considerably about 1992, 93. Now, whether it's going to grow again as a result of increased demand for housing, I don't know. But the provincial government has been quite uninterested or unwilling to open any kinds of negotiations. So there's been no meeting of the various parties. The developer has come to the city with his phase 2, which involved building an additional number of houses closer to the wetland itself, but still maintaining the wetland as a wetland area. And that's where things currently stand. The proposal sort of went ahead, met the criteria that had originally been established when they did their redesign, so it proceeded. I don't know if all of those houses are built, but certainly there has continued to be construction.
So what class does a wetland have to be before it cannot be developed over?
Well,
even the endangered species we have in there that are recognized and the government still says.
yes, well, it doesn't, there's no class that is absolutely protected. As I said, it's considered provincially significant, and the province has issued a series of a policy paper which states that no class 1, 2, or 3 wetlands should be developed. But it is strictly a policy, it's not a law, and they're primarily relying on the sort of coercion and I guess the need for certain approvals before development can proceed to lean on owners of such properties to make some accommodation that meets their particular desires.
It seems ludicrous that we have a law just out about the milkweed, that a citizen can be fined considerable amounts if he doesn't remove a few milkweed plants, and yet we have endangered species in a wetland that the developer can go ahead and knock it out when the city or the government doesn't do anything about it. It seems ludicrous to me.
Well, I'm not going to defend the government.
Even the one I for like this rule that
Don't make very much sense. It's got,
The last meeting we were at, they made some comment, I think that would have been rezoned to farmland, which was one building, and I don't know or something, that could be rezoned in the future, or is that still?
well, it has.
Is that still the?
Its rezoning hasn't changed. I mean, it's been zoned agricultural right from day one.
But still that's what it could be changed in the future to?
Well,
development?
yes, it will need to be rezoned to urban.
But nobody is still, the city or whoever?
Well,
Try to
obviously
make it green one.
the developer will only proceed with that rezoning application when he's ready to go ahead and develop the property.
So he still holds the strength.
Sorry?
The
Yes.
developer still holds the strength.
Yes. Well, it's his property, and as long as it remains his property, and as long as there's no indication that the province is going to sit down and be party to the negotiations, it doesn't seem at the moment that the city is prepared to act alone.
How many areas do we have like that?
Well, probably this one and Rattray Marsh are the only two wetlands in Mississauga.
I only recently last week went to that marsh. I heard the marsh and I went to it, and I was quite surprised what I saw. I didn't really expect. So I thought it was a tremendous asset to have there, and now you're talking about this other one. And I'm sort of disappointed here that it probably. I mean, I've seen plenty of situations where the developer just goes in and does what they have to do, and you can't stop it unless you have a lot of money and some lawyers working full time, which they do. And so you always lose in the end because you don't have the resources. Because
well,
it's
it isn't even a question of sort of losing in the end, because although an individual may be fined for taking that sort of action, if the fine is not particularly punitive, they're quite happy to pay it. It's just a part of the cost of doing business, and so you may win your case against him, but you've lost part of the exercise, and obviously until the same thing happens with heritage resources. There was a house sitting at the corner of Eglinton and Highway 10, which was accidentally flattened over the weekend, and the fellow, gee, I'm terribly sorry, that bulldozer driver just acted on some wild impulse, but aside from the fine, there isn't much you can do.
It's just like the trees disappeared on the east side of the bog suddenly one weekend. Somebody City Hall accidents.
And whenever these things appear to be, whenever there appears to be some threat, the chainsaws suddenly appear and woodlots get leveled. There was one over at Erin Mills, not Erin Mills, Winston Churchill Boulevard that disappeared on a weekend. Because there was some concern that it might attract some interest as a natural area.
But Jeff, they couldn't drain this one because they would have to drain it through what it will be a city drain, which they've had to deal with. The developer was here earlier tonight. So they couldn't go in with a bulldozer and drain it because they would have to crack into a system that would eventually be the city's system. So they will have to do it through the courts, by going to the board, by fighting out an official plan, by getting an environmental study that would allow them, under that new provincial policy, they would need an environmental study that would show there'd be no damage. I don't know how they could get an environmental study to demonstrate there'd be no damage to the bog if they were to drain it. So there are more difficulties in their role.
It is getting more difficult. And certainly,
but as you say, the best way is to have it in ownership of the government.
Just as the wetland policy, which 5 years ago didn't afford this certain level of status, now does, because it made it a little more inclusive. And in fact, they've improved the wording of their policies, but it still doesn't, there is no guarantee until the area becomes a property in public ownership.
Jeff, one question. You mentioned the northern owner. So there's more than one owner?
Yes, property is actually two developers. And the property line is if you can notice there's a lot line that goes right through the middle there, and that's the way it's north and south. The session was.
I've driven around the area, the streets around it, the Fallingbrook is on one side of it. Can you approximately show us where the development is right now in regards to the?
There is a, sent me out an illustration, but I didn't bring any of that material along. Anything like that in here.
Yeah, it's pretty close.
Pretty well all around it.
The thing that bothers me, even though the houses are close, the construction debris and junk that is now blown right into the edge of the marsh is just unbelievable. Especially on the west side, it's just horrible.
I guess we can't project nothing because it's just handed down.
But you might be able to look at that and refer to your drawing.
Okay.
It's very close, put it that way. Very close. So technically, the owner that owns the southern part, which isn't very cooperative, can't drain the southern part, he's fighting with the guy in the northern part, right?
Yes. I say that there's a road that runs just about through here. And then there's another one that probably swings along this side here. That's Rockworth Drive, goes along the southwest edge here, and then Willowdale Gardens. This is,
The east-west road, does it not go across where your laneway shows there?
Sorry.
On the southern one. The parallel road was locked, doesn't it cut across where your laneway there is?
But the causeway,
Yeah.
I don't think that part
It's
goes.
Sherwood Mills.
Yeah. Is that about it?
Well, it looks to me like it actually goes across down here.
Yeah, it's not that far going. The causeway is.
And that's where the perch catch basin is.
There's a road on east called Fallingbrook that goes
That's further over.
probably about here.
Yeah.
Because when I drove around the site recently, I noticed that along, I guess it's Fallingbrook on the west side, or whatever, southwest.
East side.
Over there,
Yeah, on
Fallingbrook.
the east side, but on the west side of the road, I guess, is that they've got marked, there's going to be a separate school there and a church, I believe. It's what they've shown on the signs.
The original proposal was for a separate school and I believe a junior public school.
Public park.
Yeah. Seems to me, I thought that there was some talk about a church, but that was on the other side of the road.
I could be wrong, I thought I'd seen
Well, it could well be. I haven't been keeping up with the development plan itself.
Well, thank you very much. This has been helpful in terms of pinpointing some of the issues and also some of the species, because I was unaware that we have such rare species that we brought. Thank you very much for coming out, and maybe some people who have questions can speak to you after this. Thank you. Yes, Carol.
I just wanted to publicly thank Jeff, because he and his wife have been very instrumental, and certainly guided me before I took over this in '92, but before that, in setting it up and assisting. And I think everyone would indicate, even the developer, that their knowledge has helped everybody move in the right direction. It's certainly been helpful to staff. We have quite a number of staff here. I think because of their involvement, are here out of respect and interest. So I just want to publicly thank you for everything that you've done in this regard. It's certainly been, without that help, nothing would have happened. Nothing positive would have happened anyway. So I want to thank you.